Let's get you moved over here. That way you're not in between the two phones. Okay. It's not particularly complicated, but you'd say it's an extremely important topic for any theistic tradition. And it really, in many ways, gets to the core of philosophy in general, whether that be a theistic or an atheistic philosophy. And so it's deep, it's primary, and it really gets to the heart of, like I said, theism and also philosophy. And the verses we're going to cover today deal with that. So it's weighty. I talked to somebody today whose grandmother's dying. She's 84 years old. They had a really nice relationship. She's with the grandmother. The grandmother's got stage 4 cancer, and she's going to pass away in the next few days. She's been going up there every weekend for the last month. It's fairly simple. Everybody dies. Grandma had a full life. You have a great relationship with your grandmother. You spend a ton of time with her. She knows you love her. You say the last step you have to say. You hold her hand and help her transition. It's fairly simple. It's not particularly exotic. It's also not particularly complicated. It's also not something which is outside of your frame of reference. So it's some sort of abstruse, complicated, abstract, difficult to comprehend subject. What it is it's one of the core issues people deal with in life. It's deep, it's primal, and it really gets to the heart of the human condition. And as such, it's a weighty topic, a difficult topic to process. Analogously, what we're going to talk about tonight is like that. It's not even an analogy. It is like that. I'm just giving you another example that might be easier for you to wrap your head around because I haven't fleshed out what we're going to talk about just yet. But I gave you a simple example I could articulate in half a minute to give you an idea of what I mean when I say it's deep, it's profound, it's primal, but it's not particularly complicated. Were you listening on your way in?
Yes.
You were. Were you? Okay. I'll start again. It's okay. No sweat. Sometimes you get complicated topics. I don't know. We could talk about quantum physics, black box radiation, quantum leaps, electromagnetism, Planck's constant. These take a minute. You can learn them, but it's complicated. Then sometimes you get simple ideas. The temperature water boils at. The temperature paper burns at. How many square feet this room is. Those are relatively easy things to explain compared to things in quantum physics. What I'm saying is that today's topic is not particularly exotic or complicated or weird or even difficult to fathom fundamentally. It is, however, dealing with the primal nature of reality. As such, the topic is weighty. And it's easy to get almost overwhelmed by the magnitude of what's being discussed. I gave an example to make it easier for you to quickly wrap your heads around what I was talking about. A friend of mine called me today. Her grandmother's dying. She called for some counseling. Her grandmother's 84, dying of stage 4 cancer. It's pretty straightforward. Everybody dies. Your grandmother dies. You've known it's coming for years. You're going to see her. You guys have a great relationship. You put a ton of time in. You don't have a lot of regrets in terms of your relationship with your grandmother. You do have regrets in your own life, and being reminded of your grandmother's mortality and the mortality of everybody, including yourself, is going to make you think about your own regrets and your own mistakes in your short life. It's going to fill you with some penitence and some pensiveness, and you're going to become very thoughtful. And but you don't want to be too thoughtful in that regard because it gets a little selfish. You want to be there for your grandmother, but at the same time, you should make sure that you also get your needs met. You would say stuff to your grandmother that made sense. You were a great grandmother. I could have asked for the grandmother. I'm so grateful to have known you. I'm going to be okay. You've taught me some valuable lessons. I'll be okay. I'll never forget you. I'll always remember you. You mean the world to me. It was like she just like called me up a bit of a mess, and I just deployed all these answers without really even requiring much discussion, because it's pretty straightforward what you're going to be experiencing and feeling when your grandmother passes away. There could have been some very specific things she was struggling with, but there wasn't. It was just the general boilerplate stuff people go through when somebody dies. If you've been with somebody who's dear to you who's died, then you know the game. That doesn't mean it's not weighty. That doesn't mean it's easy. That doesn't mean it's not deep. That doesn't mean it doesn't get to the core of the human condition, and really the core of the existential dilemma. I'm in this world. I love people. They're all taken away from me. You follow? There's a form of trauma that was theorized in the mid-90s, betrayal trauma. Betrayal trauma. And so betrayal trauma is when you trusted someone or you depended on someone, they held power over you, and then they betrayed that trust, and it was a traumatic event. And it has physical and mental symptoms. It can be diagnosed, and it can be treated, and it's quantifiable, just like traumatic events in general are quantifiable within the field of psychology. You ever heard of it?
Did you send me an article on it?
I didn't. No. And so, death is the ultimate betrayal because the person's gone. The fact that they couldn't do anything about it doesn't change that you feel abandoned and bereft and alone. The younger you are, the more acutely you'll experience this feeling of abandonment. The older you are, then the more your intellect may win the day, and you realize there's nothing they could do, and you can only go so far with your feelings of abandonment and betrayal. But make no mistake, death is the ultimate betrayal. And also make no mistake, betrayal is traumatizing. Abandonment is traumatizing. We're made to survive, we have to make connections. So to lose those connections is tantamount to death, philosophically. We're born in this world, we connect to people. That's how we sustain ourselves and survive as children, through attachment figures, and then all through adulthood as social mammals. To then lose those primary attachment figures due to inevitable time and entropy is fundamentally traumatizing, because it gets to the very core of what's wrong with our existence in the world, which is that everything is taken away from us. And so losing people you love is the ultimate betrayal, it's the ultimate abandonment, and it is the genesis of the existential dilemma. Till you're betrayed, till you're abandoned, till you lose things, life's a walk in the park. And being betrayed or abandoned by people you don't care about isn't really betrayal or abandonment. It's just random people doing stupid stuff in your vicinity. But when you get betrayed by, or you get your heart broken by, you get abandoned by someone who you depend on, it's a death-like experience. As anybody who's been through grief and trauma and death and betrayal should easily be able to attest to almost instantly. I'm so not into this stuff, but because I grew up with it, it has like, it's kind of like a comfort food type. I feel like a comfort food-esque, very visceral response to these kind of jingles, because they remind me of, the happiness and joy of this season as a child. And you got new tennis shoes, and presents, and stuff you really wanted that you had to wait for. It wasn't like you could just get it. My parents weren't real generous, and so Christmas is. But my kids, I don't think experience it quite like this because we buy them stuff all the time. I kind of making up for my bad childhood by just giving my kids way too many gifts. Anyway, so today's topic is like the death of a loved one, even if it's at the right time. It's fairly simple to discuss, but it's really weighty. It's really weighty. Okay. Here's what we're going to be talking about. And now I've got everybody's attention, which is what I wanted, because I can't explain this stuff to you guys if you're not paying attention. So the normal dance we do where you guys space out for the first 30 minutes and I have to chastise you a couple times and finally the train leaves the station, that won't work today. I need you guys listening keenly from the beginning, and I think we got there. If you are an atheist, your starting place, ultimately, for reality is math, is physics. And physics really means two things: fundamental particles, like neutrinos and bosons, subatomic particles, and fundamental forces which govern those particles: gravity, electromagnetism, strong nuclear force, and weak nuclear force. Sometimes a scientist will try to distill everything down, like Stephen Hawking did, to just coming from gravity, and all the other fundamental forces are derivative of gravity, or a variation on gravity. But whether you reduce everything down to one fundamental force or four fundamental forces, and however many fundamental particles or particulates you posit, that's what the world breaks down to from physics. And then physics builds up and becomes chemistry. And then chemistry builds up and becomes biology. But there's a problem. We can't create life from chemicals. That's called abiogenesis. Hasn't been done. Miller did some experiments. He made some kind of proto soup, prebiotic, primeval soup that he thought would mimic the conditions at the beginning of the universe. The hope was that life would be created from that. It didn't happen. And amazingly, with all the just colossal improvements to science, exponential improvements to science and our computing power almost yearly. Like, for sure, your iPhone is hundreds of times more complicated than whatever technology put a man on the moon. But despite that, we haven't created life from chemicals. So that jump from chemistry to biology is a big jump. Huge, colossal jump. And when we say chemistry to biology, we could also say from chemistry to consciousness. If we define life as being possessed of consciousness, the ability to reproduce, there's different explanations or definitions people give for what constitutes life, a certain level of organization, self-organization, a certain perpetuating of your existence, reproduction, processing of information, a certain level of consciousness. Then consciousness has to be defined as well. That's another. That can be defined simply as information processing, again, in which case life and consciousness are synonymous with one another. You could also define consciousness as something that's like to be you, your subjective self-experience, which is as fundamental a facet of reality as anything in the world. And any objective science or your ability to appreciate objective scientific truths is based on a precondition that you are conscious, that you are subjectively aware of your own existence. And so, however you may define consciousness, and however you choose to define life, there's a jump from chemistry to biology / consciousness, which has not been made. It's been assumed. That's what gives rise to what's called the hard problem of consciousness. We may be able to explain how chemicals interact with each other, but why those chemicals give you an experience of existence, allow you to have thoughts and free will and feelings. Why isn't it just all going on in the dark? The way chemistry does. The way we see chemistry going on in the dark. How come there's this incredibly rich primal experience of something that it's like to be you, your own inner world? Thoughts, feelings, sounds, colors being processed, ideas, 70,000 thoughts a day, self-reflection, metacognition, free will, various types of experiences. Okay, your neurons are firing, but why is that accompanied by pain? Why don't you just react to it? In many ways, our consciousness gets in the way of the smooth processing of chemical interactions in our body. Simpler creatures actually do better at just responding in standard ways to stimuli, whereas we respond fight, flight, or freeze. We're all mixed up. We have all sorts of different reactions. Fawn, fight, flight, freeze, fawn. All sorts of different actions people have. So, yeah. That's the problem for atheism. That's the problem for atheistic attempts to explain the world. There's life that does not appear to come from chemicals. It's called abiogenesis, the idea that life comes from chemicals. It used to be called chemical evolution. Now they call it abiogenesis. Life certainly seems to come from life. We can borrow genetic material from people and create life, but that's not the same as creating life from scratch. What to speak of evolving life from scratch. And you should figure if it happened once, it should be happening regularly. But somehow or other, life isn't evolving from chemicals anywhere, ever. Except for, we say, one time that gave rise to the multitude of species we see around us. Oh, and we can't do it. Nor can we create consciousness. Every time a ChatGPT comes out, neuroscientists just immediately stump it, make it look idiotic within like 5 minutes by asking it questions even a 5-year-old could answer. Showing that it's just representing information that it's organized from the internet with no actual conscious awareness. They're able to trick it with very simple questions. And get to do stuff like recommend you to drink poison or what have you. So, that's the big problem that confronts atheism / atheistic empirical explanations. I don't like calling them scientific because it implies that science is only empiricism. Well, I think that's kind of a loaded definition of science, because then everything is non-scientific that does not follow an empirical model. But what if things beyond empiricism exist in the world? Empiricism are things that can be proven objectively. Can you prove to me that you are conscious objectively? The answer is no. How can you know I'm conscious? How do you know I'm not a sophisticated robot? Because I react to things like you do. Therefore, analogously, you see I'm like you, and then you grant me consciousness because you are conscious, and you assume I must be too. But you can't actually experience that I'm conscious, because consciousness can only be experienced in the first person. Therefore, you can never objectively or empirically, or if you want to take a stretch and call it scientifically, prove conscious, but nonetheless, we all accept that we're all conscious. That would mean that there's non-empirical ways of knowing something's true. That would mean that there are non-empirical ways of arriving at truth, which go beyond empiricism, or being able to prove things to your five senses in some sort of objective way. So, atheism or atheistic empirical, because atheists could be non-empiricists, they could just be philosophical atheists and have other arguments, logical arguments, for example, as opposed to empirical arguments. This is the massive, colossal difficulty that atheists have in explaining the world. Namely, there's something in the world that they don't assume as a starting point. Now, you can vex them another way. You can go, why gravity? Why gravity? Why the most fundamental of fundamental forces? Why is there gravity? Where did gravity come from? And they would simply say, it's magic. It's just always been there. It's the eternal force that's always been there from the dawn of creation. Which is starting to sound pretty darn religious. But that's what you do. You have to postulate some premises that you then build your philosophy off of. And if you ask somebody enough questions, why that, why that, why that, really doing what a 5-year-old does, eventually you get the fairy dust, magic. It just is. And that's considered to be a reasonable explanation, unless a religion makes it. Then it's like non-scientific. So, that's the problem that atheists have. Their premises don't give rise in any logical, necessary way to what we find exists in the world, and therefore their premises seem insufficient to explain the world in which we inhabit. The world that we inhabit. Let me say that again. Their premises, gravity, fundamental particles, don't necessarily get us to this world in which we're having a conversation with minds, consciousness, with life. And therefore, their worldview is incomplete because it doesn't get us from there, wherever there is, to here, with conscious individuals with free will having conversations, living organisms. Did you follow that? I'll say it a third or fourth time, but that's all I can do. Atheism / empirical atheism, which is the attempt to objectively prove things by experiments that can be replicated to your five senses, fails because its premises, which are anyways magically true, they don't bother offering an explanation. So you could challenge them on that, but even if you don't challenge them on that, they still fail because their starting points don't necessarily, physics is all creates things necessarily. So they don't get us to a world in which life exists and in which consciousness exists. Therefore, their premises are insufficient to explain the world that we inhabit. Did you guys get it that time? You did or not. Just, it is what it is. It's not particularly complicated, but it's weighty because it's the fundamental nature of reality we're discussing. And normally, we don't think about the fundamental nature of reality, and therefore, these conversations are difficult because they require you to think in a different way about the nature of the world. Theists have their own problem. Theists start with consciousness. That's our premise. Consciousness is there from the beginning. Therefore, God's not so much like math, God's like a mathematician. A person who's logical and reasonable. And therefore, the mathematical laws come from him. But consciousness also comes from him, as does life. You follow? So now you've got a mathematical person, a mathematician. That means consciousness and life are there from the beginning. They're part of our premise. Therefore, we overcome the problem of explaining where does consciousness and life come from. It was there from the beginning. And that person was logical, and therefore we can also explain where math comes from. For this reason, a mathematician, a God, is a better explanation for the world in which we find ourselves than a simply mathematical explanation. You got to postulate one thing. You should postulate one thing that gets you to here, to now. The difficulty that confronts the theist is, how did matter come from spirit? How did matter come from spirit? If you say matter was the starting point, then how did consciousness come from matter is the difficulty. If you say spirit/consciousness was the starting point, then how did matter arise from something which is purely spiritual or purely conscious? That becomes a difficulty. Did you follow that? Amazingly, this philosophical conundrum was not lost on the Vedic tradition, on the philosophical tradition that we're studying now. And so Krishna is going to articulate his connection to matter in the verses we're going to study. Do you guys follow that? And now that you know what's at stake and what we're discussing, you'll be able to better appreciate Krishna's words and their import. Let's go back a couple verses to 9:4. Maya tatam idam sarvam jagat avyakta murtina. Text 4, chapter 9, page 388 in my book. Might be a little differently numbered in your book because we're working from multiple editions. We print these things off like hotcakes. Maya tatam idam sarvam jagat avyakta murtina. Obviously, you're reading the Roman letters, which show you what Sanskrit sounds like, and we're reading those words. Do you guys see that? Maya tatam idam sarvam jagat avyakta murtina. Can you guys see that? Hey, sir, you see it? You got it? Hey, hat, you see it? You're getting there? Look on the spine. 9:4 is what you're looking for. You found it? All right, let's do it again. You guys ready? Maya tatam idam sarvam jagat avyakta murtina. The whole universe is pervaded by me in an invisible form. Matstani sarva bhutani. All beings reside in me. Nachaham teshu avasita. But I don't reside in them. So Krishna says he's throughout the whole universe. Then he says he's not in the universe. That's if it's a paradox, if we can explain it, it's an apparent contradiction. If you can't explain the apparent contradiction, it's a contradiction. If you can explain the apparent contradiction on a higher level, then it becomes a paradox. Matstani sarva bhutani, all beings are in me. Nacha matstani bhutani, all beings are not in me. There's another apparent contradiction. Pashame yogam aishwaram, behold my mystic power. Bhuta Brit Nacha Bhuta Sta. I maintain all beings, I'm not in all beings. Mamatma Bhuta Bhavana, myself is the very source of beings. That's some weighty stuff. It's like classic Upanishadic language, super confusing, dense, almost koanic, very difficult to unpack. Then Krishna says, Yata akasha stito nityam vayu sarvatra go mahan. Just as, he gives an analogy, the great wind blows everywhere while residing in space. Tata, so also, sarvani bhutani matstani ti upadar. Try to understand also that in the same way, all beings reside in me. Space now becomes an accommodating principle. That is a fundamental aspect of reality, space-time. And mass. So these fundamental features of the universe. And air, particles of oxygen and hydrogen, so on and so forth, carbon, whatever, carbon dioxide, right? Those may exist within space, but you could extract all the atoms from space, you'd still be left with the accommodating principle of space, which never mixes with the atoms that inhabit it. It just acts as a resting place for those atoms. Krishna uses that perfect analogy. It still lasts today. It still works today to explain his immanence existing within this world and his transcendence existing beyond the world. If you make him too transcendent, then the world has no connection to God, and then where did the world come from? And you have to posit a Satan figure to explain the world, or you're left with having to give an atheistic explanation for the world. If you want to say the world came from God, then you have to explain how matter came from God, but you can't do so to such an extent that God becomes materialized or affected by matter, because then you no longer have an eternal, omnipresent, omnipotent deity. So you got to walk this fine line where you posit how the material world came from God, but God's a little bit aloof. And you need immanence and transcendence in a philosophy which attempts to tackle both those problems and show how God can be both immanent in this world and transcendent beyond this world. That philosophy is called, in English, panentheism. Exactly. Panentheism. Good. There's other Sanskrit terms. Shuddha-dvaita, Advaita-dvaita, Vishishta-dvaita. There's other Sanskrit terms that are used to explain this feature of the world, because that concept existed in India thousands of years ago, whereas panentheism was just invented, I think it's a German term, and then entered in the English language in the 1800s. It's a fairly recent idea within Western thought. Maybe there's older precursors to it. But you find it really well articulated as a philosophical paradigm. Because the one thing is, God says, I'm immanent, I'm transcendent. And then a philosopher comes along and goes, oh, he's both immanent and transcendent. That's different. That could just be two conflicting views of reality, and then some smart person comes along and tries to reconcile them. This is actually attempting to make the philosophical argument that I'm both immanent and transcendent. You follow? And therefore, the Vedic literatures are the first instance of panentheism in world literature. Okay, now we are dealing with today's verses. Sarva bhutani kaunteya prakritim yanti mamikam. All beings, they go to my prakriti, my nature. Kalpakshaye, at the end of creation. They again go to my nature. Kalpadhau vishrajam yaham. And at the beginning of creation, I again manifest them. So what Krishna is saying here is that after a day of Brahma, which is, whatever that is, 311 billion years, after a day of Brahma, then living beings, I believe it's 311, 4.32 million times 1,000 would be 4.32 billion. My bad. 4.32 billion. After 4.32 billion years, according to what we got in terms of time from the 8th chapter. At the end of a kalpa, everyone is sucked in and conserved by God. Almost like an ekpyrotic universal model where you postulate that the world is created and then returns to its singularity, and then is created again and bounces back and forth between two membranes. It's kind of a modern, in the last 20 years, theory of physics, cosmological theory of physics. And so kind of like that. There's a bouncing back and forth of creation and then conservation, and creation and then preservation, and creation and then like that. And so Krishna is saying that all of us exist within him, like air exists within space. And not just that he's the cosmic principle, but we actually are sucked back in to him and then sent forth again. There's a personal aspect to it. There's a conscious aspect to it. There's a person possessed of power making that happen. There's a mathematician and not merely a mathematical formula. Can you read the English with me? O son of Kunti, at the beginning of the millennium, all material manifestations enter into my nature at the end of the millennium, and at the beginning of another millennium, by my potency I create them again. A millennium is 1,000 years, but a millennium is also any extremely long period of time. So the word millennium is oftentimes used to indicate any extremely long period of time. And here the millennium is 1,000 Chatur Yugas, which make up one day of Brahma. So it's actually a correct use, 1,000 of something. And in this case, it's 1,000, 4.32 million years, which is 4.32 billion years. Prakritim swam avastabhya. They depend on my own nature. Vishrajami puna puna, and I create them again and again. Bhutagramam mam imam kritsnam avasham prakriter vashat. And by my power, by the power of my nature, I completely create the universe again and again. And the beings that are conserved and then sent forth again, they are helpless in this process. So Krishna is claiming an omnipotence, and in contrast, we are very small in terms of our power, such that we are forced to abide by the laws of karma and be created again and again. This could refer to reincarnation. It could refer to a cosmic day, all of us being sent forth, and then there's a period of conservation. Sometimes we just go on like this forever. Sometimes the universe comes to an end, and we still continue to exist, but we exist in a conserved state. And when the universe is created again, we're also created with it. This is the Vedic cosmology. The whole cosmic order is under me. Under my will, it is automatically manifested again and again, and under my will, it's annihilated at the end. Na cha mam tani sa karmani. Na cha mam tani karmani nibadnanti dhananjaya. I am not bound down by these acts. These acts do not bind me. Because if Krishna was intimately implicated in the creation and dissolution of the universe, he now becomes materialized. And he becomes affected by the goings and comings. And so Krishna makes it clear, none of this work, none of this karma, nibadnanti, na nibadnanti, it doesn't tie me down. Rather, udasina vat asinam. Asana means seat in Sanskrit. Asinam, seated. Udasina, the same word again. Ut, asina, vat. I am seated as if seated above it. Uttasina means seated above it. Asinam, I am seated. Vat means in the, like with this quality. I am seated as if I'm seated above it all. In other words, I'm transcendent. I'm beyond this material world. It's all going on, and at the same time, it doesn't define me. It doesn't implicate me. It doesn't materialize me. It doesn't affect me. Asaktam teshu karmasu. I am unattached in doing all these acts. All this work cannot bind me. I'm ever detached from all these material activities, seated as though neutral. Are you guys seeing what's going on here? Krishna is postulating the world's connected to him, and then he immediately goes and tells you how it's not connected to him. Now he's going to tell you again how it's connected to him. Maya jakshena prakrite suyate sachara acharam. By me, this material world is overseen. It's supervised. Adyaksha means supervised. Like you're looking at it from above. Overseen. Supervised. That's the word used here. Adyaksha. Maya, by me. Adyakshena, by me overseeing it. Suyate, prakriti. Prakriti, the nature, is overseen by me. Suyate sa chara acharam. It creates all moving and non-moving beings. Plants and animals, you could say. We say plants and animals, which gets a little complicated. Coral used to be called a plantimal, because it had some features of being a plant, some features of being an animal. Now it's viewed properly as being a stationary plant, a stationary animal. Which is a bummer for me, because I wanted to get my wife some coral bangles. But I couldn't, because I'm not going to buy her a dead animal. And so the really good coral in the world comes from Sardinia, off the coast of Italy. So that what they call ox blood, that really red color coral. They dye coral, but you can still get the really nice red coral. I was so excited that it was a plantimal. This is what I thought was in the 60s, but then I got some up-to-the-minute research and realized it was an animal, and there went my dreams of buying coral. So anyway, in Vedic times, they defined life as moving or not moving, which in some ways is cool because it gets around the plant versus animal, although plant versus animal also has a lot of value too. It's also an elegant way of defining things. Hetu nanena kaunteya jagat viparivartate. This is the cause for the revolution of the world, for the world's revolving. Interesting enough, they use the term revolving. Vipadi vartate, for the world turning around on itself, completely turning around on itself. And so this is the cause. This is what causes the world to revolve. So Krishna, he said, everything is in me, right? I'm the cause of everything, right? But it's just resting within me like air and space. But actually, I'm powerfully creating and uncreating the world. But actually, I'm indifferent. But actually, I'm overseeing it. He's trying to walk back and forth and bounce back and forth and walk that razor's edge to give a sense of how Krishna is connected to the creation and at the same time beyond this creation. The material nature, which is one of my energies, is working under my direction, producing all moving and non-moving beings. Under its rule, this manifestation is created and annihilated again and again. Then he switches gears a little bit, and this is the last verse we'll treat today. Avajananti mam mudha. Fools, deluded people, think of me disparagingly. They think less of me. They think of me disparagingly. They think little of me. Manushim tanum ashrita, because I have a human-like form. Param bhavam ajananto, they don't know my higher nature as the cause of the cosmos. Mama bhuta maheshwaram, and then they don't know my higher nature and that I am the great Lord of all beings. This again is the mathematician speaking about how it's difficult to wrap your head around the idea of a personal creator. It's difficult to wrap your head around the idea of a truly proper conception of divinity, which is both related to the world and distinct from the world, which is both immanent in this world and transcendent above this world, which is the cause of this creation, but at the same time allows for us to have free will. And that mixing without merging, that touching without disintegrating into something, that God's ability to maintain his distinctness and his aloofness and at the same time participate in the world, of course, is reasonable for an omnipotent being. But it's nonetheless difficult to wrap your head around. Fools deride me when I descend into human form. They do not know my transcendental nature as the supreme Lord of all that is. So there you go. We worked through some verses. Those verses are an attempt to articulate a doctrine of panentheism. They require you to bounce back and forth between these ideas. If we were going to try to hew these ideas together, which I've already done to some extent, but I was going to try to really cleanly do it, we would say that Krishna creates the universe as an aspect of himself so that we can explore this universe and use our minute free will. Because God is the source of everything, he never truly loses touch with his creation. But his connection to this universe is remote. And in fact, matter is really just misidentified spirit. Because everything is still ultimately connected to Krishna. And if you discover this reality about the world, the matrix disintegrates, and you can see what's actually happening in the world, where everything is still potentially connectable to God, including you and everything else, where God is perfectly overseeing the universe through the law of karma, and at the same time allowing us to have independence, to have free will, and to move and operate on our own. And so God has the beauty of being the source of the cosmos, and at the same time not implicated in the imperfections of the cosmos. And you can worship Krishna as a transcendent being, and ultimately our solution to the conundrum of what exists, spirit or matter, is just like the atheist. We say only spirit exists. But there's directly connected to Krishna spirit, and there's indirectly connected to Krishna, remotely connected to Krishna spirit, which goes by the name matter. And that's how we collapse the distinction between spirit and matter, between body and mind, under a mathematician who gives rise to both math as well as consciousness. I'm tired. I've had a long day. I said that correctly. I don't imagine all of you followed it perfectly. I'm not going to say it 4 more times because I felt like I did a good job there, and like I said, I'm tired. But I would like some feedback from you, and we have a little bit of time left. So give me some feedback. You see what I mean about how it's weighty? It's not particularly complicated. We're talking about the fundamental nature of reality. We should all be thinking about this stuff. But if you haven't before, it's a brain stretcher. Feedback. Yes.
I have a question. What would be the purpose of like contraction?
Okay. I think an easy explanation is that sometimes things reach their natural end and they require to be, like a rubber band gets overly stretched, it loses its elastic capacity. The nature of the material world is entropy. Sometimes things degrade to such a state that they need to be restored. And so in the same way that you degrade, and if you didn't degrade, there would be no impetus for you to grow. Your death and old age and reincarnation offers a very subtle impetus for you to grow that does not mitigate against or what do I want to say, compromise your free will. You still have free will, but you're given a little bit of an impetus to grow. You follow? There are beings that live much longer than you in the universe. The universe can also be conceived of as a being. And that universe also needs that entropy worked within it to then allow for another chance, another opportunity. And so with you as a microcosm, so also with the macrocosm. You reach a certain point where time is required to give you an impetus to grow without compromising your free will. And that is the destruction of the universe and the recreation of the universe. It's a good question. I've never been asked that question, so it made me actually think that. I just thought of that answer now. This is a good question. It's a good answer. Not in our text, but sometimes something isn't covered in our text, so you have to think of what would be an answer that was consistent with our text and reasonably solves for the problem. And you're allowed to do that. And so that's what I did. More. Yeah.
Thank you for this class and for setting it up so nicely. I've always conflated the idea.
I'm also not firing on all cylinders, but somehow or other, this is what we had to do today. This is the topic that came up today. So it is what it is. I can't pick the topic. We're working through the text, so this is what we get. This is what we had to work with. Go ahead.
I've always had a hard time understanding how matter can come from spirit.
Yeah, you've had a hard time understanding the actual question that we're discussing. You had a hard time understanding the entire topic. And so now you at least have an understanding of what's at stake, what the topic is. You might not have mastered the answers, but you at least understand something of the nature of the discussion that we're having. And that's a win. That's good. Right? That's what you're trying to say?
Yes, and I have a question. I think part of my difficulty in even understanding the question is that I conflated spirit and consciousness. So when I see...
I don't think it's wrong to conflate spirit and consciousness, or to see them as in many ways being synonymous. What's the problem with that? You would just say covered consciousness, covered spirit. It works perfectly with the explanation I offered.
I have a hard...
Stop. I just answered your question. You're just attached to having a valid question that wasn't anticipated, dismissed in a single sentence. So you're going to waste your time and mine by arguing for your question again when it's already been answered. Let me say it again. Please listen carefully. Spirit and consciousness can very easily be seen as synonymous. You can just add in that spirit/consciousness can be covered or uncovered. If it's covered, that gets us material consciousness in this world. And the problems associated with mind. Pure consciousness is synonymous with spirit. We are units of consciousness. God is a conscious being, a pure conscious being. As long as you allow for that dual manifestation of consciousness, which works into our theory, because I've mentioned remote matter, remote spirit. So material consciousness would be remote consciousness, disconnected from God. Then it works just fine, and it solves the problem you're seeing. Response?
Thank you for saying it again.
Did you get it that time? Don't be so quick. You're not that smart. You're not ahead of me. You're behind me. You have to learn how to listen. All right? And if I'm able to anticipate your question like that and give you an answer, you need to stop and not let your ego get in the way and just be able to hear the answer. That's to your benefit. And it shortens the learning process dramatically. It's insulting to a teacher to make him repeat himself over and over again because it becomes like some sort of indulgent thing where the class is about you getting your moment in the spotlight, where you get to ask your question and sound sophisticated. You follow?
Yes.
Okay.
I appreciate the way you led the chat. You started off with this concept of death and death of a loved one, then explaining transition and how it fits in with these verses. So I was able to anchor on that. So I was able to apply. When I think about death now, for me it becomes what the seed for even deeper belief in Christians, because everything is coming from him, everything is happening from him.
Yeah, there's the death of the universe, which is really a restoring it to its connection to Krishna. And your death is an opportunity for you to also reconnect with Krishna and revitalize yourself. Sleep is also seen like that. Some of our theologians, they postulate that when you sleep, you come in contact with Brahman. And that's how you get energized by sleep. And so this idea that we are constantly in touch with divinity and being renewed by divinity, and that it's intrinsic to our existence. It's a different view of the world. It's a theistic view of the world, where at every moment you're connected to divinity, and it's a model from which you can springboard off and experience that. It's a theoretical model that's workable and coherent, and then you can explore it and see what comes out of it. And you can have amazing experiences of God within this world and find the world is incredibly inspirational. And that death becomes a great returning home. The Christians didn't have it all wrong. We just think it's like trite, like almost like non-philosophical. Like you'll just go back to heaven when you die, even though you ate McDonald's every day your whole life. And you know what I mean? You use drugs every day your whole life and you're a complete materialist. But somehow or other, because you said, I believe in Jesus, that's enough, and you go back to heaven. It's so cheesy. But the idea that I'm going home, you follow? The idea that I'm going home to a place where rainbows never die. You follow? Does that make sense? And you find that in Christian spirituals, essentially the music of black slaves and freed slaves, and also, English and Scottish immigrants that came over here with their instruments and that were Christians. They talk about this going home, crossing over the Jordan, sling low, sweet chariot. I'm going home to see my mother, going home, no more to roam. You follow? And so you find this sentiment that, my body's worn out. I'm on my way out. But it's okay because I'm coming back to you. It's like this great promise, this great hope, this great joy that soars despite the fact that the body is decaying. The Christians didn't have it all wrong. And slavery was that incomparable suffering. That incomparable suffering. Gave rise to some beautiful stuff. Because it really makes people dig deep to look for freedom, to look for truth, to look for something that can't be taken away from them. In the modern age, Auschwitz gave rise to people like Viktor Frankl, which are just like incredibly beautiful lessons that just have such universal applicability and point to the last vestige of human freedom, what can never be taken away from you. And so, yeah, you didn't grow up a Christian, fortunately for you, but what you're feeling is that confidence and warmth and trust that theists all over the world have felt when they found a worldview that made sense, that put Krishna behind everything. Does that make sense? Great. Anything else? Yes.
I loved when you said that matter is misidentified spirit.
Matter's misidentified spirit, right? That's a winner, isn't it?
That's beautiful.
Okay, let's go. Thank you, IGTV. Thank you, Facebook. Yeah, matter is misidentified spirit, right? Yeah.